So I heard about this wife who asked her husband, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Of course I love you." And she said to him, "If I ask you to do a favor for me, will you do it?" And he said, "For you, anything." And she said, "Will you kill a lion for me?" And he said, "Oh, I mean, a lion, come on. Are you mad? No, what do I know about lions? What do I know about hunting? Ask me something else." And she said, "Okay, can we go through your text messages?" And he said, "What is that lion you want me to kill?" So, I want to talk to you today about the right thing to do. And yes, today we read Shabbat Shmini, and basically has two parts. And they are both very interesting, very interesting. And I have to say, to a certain extent, my inspiration for this week's sermon is coming from the events that we observed this past week, especially the Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day. And which is interesting because Shmini always falls around, or is read around, Yom HaShoah. So there are many messages in this parsha that could be, actually it's fascinating how these coincidences, right? So the topic of the parsha can be linked to Yom HaShoah. The first part of the parsha is talking about the Kohanim, the priests, but especially this episode of the Ezra. We don't really know what's really happened. Two of the sons of Aaron, they were presenting a sacrifice. Something was not right. They died. And Aaron was devastated. He was silent. He couldn't understand. What was wrong? Why something happened there? He was heartbroken. Moses tried to comfort him. Nevertheless, Aaron remained silent. Of course, I think, should I talk about the fact that sometimes we feel the same way after the Shoah, that we don't know what to say. We're in shock. Yes, people tried to comfort us, but it's so difficult to find the right words. Nevertheless, I have to give kudos to Moses that he tried to comfort his brother. And in the same way that we learn from that section of the Torah, that if you have the opportunity to try to comfort somebody who is in pain, somebody who suffered a loss, nevertheless, even though to pick the right words is very difficult, yes, you should do that. But the second half of the parsha is something that Rabbi Anibal actually mentioned. He was explaining a little bit as we were reading the Torah. It's talking about all the laws of kashrut. What is kosher? What is not? And of course, that list includes different categories. One will be the mammals, or in other words, the animals that walk this earth. I believe the Torah called them the behemoth. The behemoth. And we learn about the characteristics, that they have to have split hooves, they have to chew their cud, and have to ruminant. That's the technical word of the animals. That's why we can eat cow, but we cannot eat pig. Okay, it's nothing wrong about the pig except that it doesn't fall into the category. It doesn't have the two marks for a kosher animal. Then he's talking about the birds, and he gives the list. We don't really know what it is, but yes, as Rabbi Anibal mentioned, it seems to be a consensus among the rabbis that the list is talking about birds of prey, and those are the ones we are not allowed to eat. For the fish, they have to have fins and scales in order to be kosher. And there is another category that is very interesting. We never talk about it, but it's the insects. Well, the insects are basically not kosher, except for the ones that jump, which is basically the locust or some kind of crickets. And those actually, believe it or not, are kosher. In fact, let me tell you this story. For the 8th plague, when it's the plague of locust, you will see that after the plague was over, God sent a wind to clean the land from the locusts. And I would say, why would God do something like that? You know, when the plague of frogs was sent to Egypt, after the plague, the frogs were still there and they started to decompose, and it was terrible for the Egyptians. So why not to do the same with the locusts? Just leave them there. It's probably gross to have dead locusts everywhere, but no, because the rabbi said when the Egyptians saw these millions of locusts coming at them, they kind of celebrated, and they went with big barrels to catch them because they ate them. So God said, oh, really? You want to get the locust? No, so fast. So God sent the wind and cleaned the locust from the land. So it's not so crazy that it is considered kosher, because it was something that is to be eaten in the Middle East. We don't eat locusts anymore because the rabbis are not sure which one are the ones that they are specifically mentioned in the Torah, so they decided to avoid any confusions. We don't need it. But the one that I wanted to mention is one of the birds that is mentioned there as forbidden, which is the Hasidah, or the stork. What's so crazy about the stork not being kosher? And it's the fact that the rabbis understand that the word Hasidah comes from the root chesed, which means kindness. How can something whose name is kindness is not kosher? Isn't that kind of crazy? And let me explain why this is so crazy. Because the whole idea of kashrut, the idea of having something that is kosher, something that is not kosher, is to inspire us. In fact, the word kosher means proper or the right thing. And yes, it's not mentioned in the Torah, but that's why eventually the rabbi used that word to specify that if something is proper, something is the right thing to eat, for example, then you eat it. It's not proper, it's not the right thing to eat, you don't eat it. But that's why the word kosher also could be applied to things that they are beyond food. Sefer Torah could be kosher, mean that it's proper to be read, is the right thing, is that there is nothing wrong with it, or could be not kosher if it's not proper. A letter is missing, it's broken, and so forth. So that's why the word kosher is so interesting, because it extends beyond food. But so how can we say that the Hasidah that represent chesed, that represent kindness, is not proper? It's not the right thing to do. If we are what we eat, then how is possible? And then the Ramban with an N at the end. Don't confuse it with the Rambam, the Maimonides, the Ramban, the Nachmanides. He said something very interesting about the Hasidah. He said, yes, the Hasidah, the stork, is an animal that does chesed, kindness, but only to its kind, only to its friends, and no one else. And in Judaism, we know that chesed should be performed, should be done to everyone, not only to our kind, not only to our friends. That's why we despise a place like Sodom. If you read the Midrashim about Sodom, it would say clearly that they were very nice to each other. They built this amazing city, collaborating among citizens, but they were brutal to foreigners. And we know the story with Lot, the Abraham nephew. When the angels went to get Lot out of the city, I don't want to give you too many details, but go read it in the Torah, what the people of Sodom tried to do to them, because they were not part of their group. So yes, they were very nice among them, but they were brutal towards other people. So the rabbi said, that characteristic is not proper. That characteristic is not the right thing. So that's why we don't eat the Hasidah, even though it implies chesed. Because to learn through what we eat that doing chesed only to your kind is good, is proper, that's incorrect. And now that we observed Yom HaShoah, there are basically three things that I can see year after year in that observance. We remember the dead. We remember the heroes. In fact, the real name of Yom HaShoah is Yom HaShoah ve'agevura, the Holocaust and Heroism Day. But there is another thing that we remember year after year, and it's about the righteous among the nations. The people who were not Jewish, but nevertheless they risked their lives to protect the Jew. It's interesting because if you count all the countries that they were allies to the Nazis, how many millions people lived in those countries? Yad Vashem recognized only about 28,000 righteous among the nations, that they were eventually properly identified and properly honored. And this is something that I actually was reading this week, and I was very touched, very, very moved by it when it was announced that Prince Philip from England died. And I didn't know that his mother was one of these righteous among the nations. In fact, she's buried in Israel. And she saved a whole Jewish family for over a year in Greece to protect them from the Nazis. So I was thinking, what an amazing thing to remember year after year. As we remember our dead, we remember the heroes, but also remember how important it is to do chesed, not just to your kind, but to everybody else. To be sure that we can help not only our friends, but everybody that is in need. And that's why year after year, we also remember the righteous among the nations. And there is something that I learned, is that when you do a favor to somebody else, just forget about it. But when somebody does a favor to you, always remember it. Shabbat Shalom.